It's Tuesday, October 29th, 2013, and you're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock. With me this week, as always, is Kathleen Royston.
Hello!
And joining us we have a very special in-studio guest. Well, two of them, really. We have Butch, the non-gender conforming unicorn.
Hello!
And also Harrison Thornhill.
Hello.
A good friend of ours from seminary. On this week's show, we'll be talking about a radical bishop and someone else's response to that, some judicial council decisions, and the brain drain of the Methodist Church caused by its lack of inclusion. But we start tonight with a radical bishop in the news. There's a Kenyan saying that says every village needs their madman. And the Methodist Church perhaps has theirs in one of the best ways. Bishop Talbert performed a same-sex union in the grand state of Alabama. The couple had been previously legally married in one of the states that has legalized gay marriage, but they wanted a church wedding. And so Bishop Talbert of the United Methodist Church performed that ceremony, marrying these two men. And, of course, this being the state of affairs in the United Methodist Church, kicked off a firestorm of controversy, with the key response coming from a group known as Good News. Now, for those of us who live and die Methodist politics, this is a name we hear a lot. But Good News is a group that says to advocate Wesleyan orthodoxy, which often takes the form of opposing LGBTQ inclusion, particularly on issues of ordination and marriage. They issued a statement calling for the Council of Bishops of the United Methodist Church to discipline Bishop Talbert. And I'm going to quote a couple pieces from their statement. The main part of it is the last paragraph. Good News calls upon the Council of Bishops to exercise discipline and hold Bishop Talbert accountable, as they have publicly promised to do on several occasions. A failure to hold accountable Bishop Talbert and other clergy who are flaunting our church's policies will result in the unraveling of our church's covenant and order. Formal separation may not be far behind. The implicit threat here is, if you don't hold clergy accountable for performing same-sex marriages, the Good News and their followers or their constituents will pick up their toys and go home. And this is a more overt threat than they have made previously. So what are, I'll throw this out for discussion. What are y'all's thoughts both on Bishop Talbert and his actions, and then what Good News is saying in response to that?
I find the use of the word flaunting really interesting, a very interesting use of the term. But as far as Bishop Talbert's concerned, I think the fact that it took place in Alabama is really significant in the sense that he claims that he's standing for justice. Mm-hmm. Because in Alabama, it's clearly not legal for gays to get married. And so it's not only saying something to the church, but it's also saying something to the greater society.
It's doing it in the heart of a place that stands against inclusion. Yeah. And so it's both within an institution that is currently standing against inclusion, or at least full inclusion, and in a place that has a history of standing against inclusion on a lot of fronts.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
I would also like to point out that the bishop of the conference, the Alabama West Florida Conference, asked Bishop Talbert to not perform the ceremony there.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting little fact. So, Bishop Talbert is from the Western jurisdiction, so performing a ceremony in the Southeastern jurisdiction, and there was a request that he did not do that.
Well, and the Council of Bishops had issued a statement previously saying, "Don't do this. Mm-hmm. We'll punish you. You're gonna get in trouble," and that's part of what Rob Renfro and his folks at Good News are trying to make sure happens, that there will be a clergy trial about this, and this will, as has happened in other places, he'll get, punished and possibly, removed from his post over this. I find it interesting, the kind of overt threat of of splitting the church.
I had a question on that. Is that, to my knowledge, that is the first time I've heard anyone on the right conservative side of this issue in the United Methodist Church to say something in relation to the threat of splitting. I've heard that on the left. I haven't heard it on the right. Is that something new?
It's difficult to know the level of public knowledge it's reached. In conversations, semi-public conversations that I observed with Rob Renfro, the leader of Good News, at General Conference in 2012, he was talking about it.
Okay.
But the phrasing wasn't like this. It was, if this gets pushed too far, there could be a split. The people I represent, would leave over this. This, I think, to me, sounds like an escalation. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much of it's the first time, but it's certainly an escalation from 18 months ago, where it was kind of more of a tacit or implied threat. And here it's very overt. This could cause our covenant to unwind. Formal separation could be part of it.
I think it's interesting because I remember I had a good friend in college who was United Methodist, and at 2004's General Conference, which is almost where the Methodist Church split. It was ugly. There was a broken communion chalice. It was bad news. So I've heard these conversations for 8 years, 9 years. These have been going on. I think that there's something to think about with this. Is the strength of the United Methodist Church that it is all under the same polity and under the same umbrella? Is that really what our identity as Methodists is being part of this United Methodist Church? And I'm not sure that splitting would be the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it depends. I mean, we talk about the importance of connection, and that we are we're an open polity and we're an open theology. That, the joke I always say is wherever 3 or more Methodists are assembled, there will be an argument.
And a committee.
And a committee to resolve the argument.
Over years.
And it'll still be a split vote. Sorry. And so I think there is some value in being a big tent. Yeah. That we're not always just surrounded by people we agree with. So I think overall, in the big picture, diversity is value. Mm-hmm. However, if we go back historically to how this vote has been falling out since 1972, and right now, if you just polled the United States, we'd be able to pass inclusive legislation. Mm-hmm. Yep. So maybe it is Rob and his team pick up their toys and go home, but right now it doesn't actually look like they'll walk away with the majority of Methodist churches in the United States. Mm-hmm. So it'll become very much like what has happened in the Episcopal Church,
yep.
where the majority of the U.S. Mm-hmm. is standing on one thing, and then a smaller group within the U.S. and then the African churches are standing together on another side.
And I don't think it is the worst thing in the world. I think there have been points in our history, and there have been points in our history as Methodists, where the church has split over issues and then come back together again years later when tensions have died down a little bit and conversations can be had in light of social change.
And what's interesting
I think that splitting it's just, there are times to be together and there are times to be apart.
Well, and we talked about this some on the special we did with Brian Elrod about the Eddie Fox situation at Candler, but possibly the split is just what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. I had a professor in undergrad. I took a political philosophy course, and basically his message was there are some issues that cannot be settled by democratic processes. Because they're all or nothing issues, and democratic processes rely on the ability to compromise. So slavery was one of those, and it's why we had to fight the Civil War. Because slavery is all or nothing, right? It's either there is slavery or there isn't. And abolitionists aren't going to be happy until there's no slavery, and pro-slavery folks aren't going to be happy if there's no slavery. So it's incompatible. Abortion's another one of those issues. Either there is abortion or there isn't. And his argument was gay marriage. He was talking obviously from a U.S. political aspect. We don't have the same kind of inclusion issues. There are plenty of gay congressmen. So that kind of issue isn't as there in U.S. politics. But gay marriage, what he was talking about, and gay marriage is another one of those things that really can't be compromised on. It's either there is or there isn't. And those who are in favor of it want it to be, and those who are against it don't want it to be. And the Methodist Church, we ran into this issue and with slavery, and we split because we rely on a democratic process. We have no pope. We have no lead bishop that makes these decisions. We have a democratic process in the General Conference, and so we split. And so I think the only way for this issue is for one side to win and one side to lose, or for both sides to claim a victory by rupturing the union. I don't. Those are only two ways this can play out.
And I almost feel like if there's a way, amicable divorce. Like if there's a point where we can say, we are not going to resolve this issue. I mean, I think at General Conference you had the Slaughter-Hamilton Amendment.
Yep, which failed.
Which was we think we're just going to acknowledge publicly that we don't agree on this. And even that didn't pass.
and that was the only thing that even went up for a vote, because we gave up on the rest of it after that.
Right. And so I think there is, quite frankly, I wonder if the animosity on both sides would be lessened considerably if there was an amicable split. Now, of course, in the Methodist Church, you get into property stuff, and you're,
right,
deciding who gets the dog.
Well, and I think that's part of what's at issue here,
yeah.
And that's why, you don't want to be the side that causes the rupture, because whoever actually is the side that walks away is the side that walks away from all the property.
Although,
but it's not just property, or as Kathleen said, the dog. It's the money that comes with that,
yeah.
And it's the apportionments that come with that property and that congregation.
Yep.
And I think part of it on both sides actually is a little bit of fear of, can we still survive if we split? And I think what we see in the good news argument, and what we saw, I think with the Hamilton Slaughter Amendment at General Conference, I think we saw a lot of this, oh my God, we're losing ground, we have to panic and hold on to everything we have.
Let me quickly define, for those of you, again, who
have social lives
and weren't at General Conference
or watching the live stream while on the phone with your boyfriend yelling in.
So the Slaughter-Hamilton Amendment was a proposed language, the United Methodist Book of Discipline, our law book, our book of rules, not like our divine law book, our book of rules for running a church, that said, okay, so the church has this official position on homosexuality, that it is incompatible with Christian teachings. And that remains true, that's still the stance of the church, but there are many who disagree. And that was pretty much all it said. And that failed 60% to 40%.
And that came after other attempts at more
radical, yeah.
More radical.
Well, and we pitched it. Sorry, I say we. I was connected to this, but it was submitted first because we were trying to ramp up the intensity. Mm-hmm. So let's start with the lowest intensity thing first. This statement that simply says, we agree to disagree. And this led to, on the floor of General Conference, the usual round of homosexuality getting compared to bestiality, and all the wildly inappropriate things that get said in these kind of debates. And it led to after it was defeated, it led to a several hour-long floor protest, which I was a part of, and lots of kind of outpouring, and eventually just all inclusion legislation got pulled, because if we couldn't pass that, we couldn't pass anything. So that's what the Slaughter-Hamilton Amendment is that we keep talking about.
I just feel like if we can't pass legislation that is a statement of fact, because that's really what it was, is we acknowledge that there's disagreement on this. If that kind of statement can't pass, we're really at an impasse. I think where it gets complicated is, as far as polity goes, is, voting, and we're a world church, and so churches outside the United States tend to vote a certain way on this issue, and so that gets really complicated. I think that's a huge challenge. And I wonder if the Good News movement decides to split off, what happens with the world church business?
Well,
what does that look like? Does that look like the Episcopalians?
My bet is probably there's a very strong alliance between the two conservative caucuses, the Good News movement, Good News, which is their kind of news arm, their broadcasting arm, and then the Confessing movement, which they have built a very strong alliance with the African delegations, who tend to vote very conservatively on these kind of social issues, particularly on the issue of inclusion. And my sense is on a lot of things, in terms of how they vote, in terms of who they nominate, they stand together. And a lot of it centers on how they stand on this issue, and a few other, what gets pitched is, kind of purity or holiness issues. I disagree that that's how you characterize this, but that's how they characterize this. So my bet is, they go with Good News Confessing, and you have the Wesleyan Orthodox Methodist Church and the Reconciling United Methodist Church, and that's possibly one of the optimal outcomes. The other one, and I don't know if I've said this on this show before, but I've certainly been saying this, is there's another way to do this. It's you got to recognize that pro-inclusion holds the majority of delegations within the United States. Yep. And what defeats it every time is the alliance between Good News Confessing and the African delegations. Yep. And not to tip my hand for going into General Conference 2016, but if you can find a way to structure the discipline such that the U.S. gets its own vote and gets to structure its own discipline on this issue, a lot of things change very rapidly.
Yes.
So here's what you need to do. If you really want to solve this issue and stay a United Methodist Church, you become a slightly less United Methodist Church. You turn the United States into a central conference, which is the same designation we give the African, all the other, what used to be called mission conferences, which that's racist, so we call them central conferences, which is only slightly less racist. And then the U.S. is divided up into jurisdictions, which function basically like central conferences. So you turn the U.S. into its own central conference, and then you give each central conference the right to decide aspects of its own discipline, aspects of its own rules, which the Africans want anyways, because they want to change the rules on ordination because they don't see the need for college requirement. All these things is relevant to them, and so they want freedom on some issues. We want freedom on some issues. And so you broker a deal that says, okay, U.S. becomes a central conference, and we get to decide ordination rules for discipline, on the discipline, and marriage rules for the discipline. And then this thing changes in 2 to 3 quadrennia.
There's some really great information if you want to nerd out on central conferences and making the U.S. a central conference. The Methodist Federation for Social Action has been working on this issue for a very long time, and their website has really wonderful literature about this. They've done presentations. It's something that they advocate strongly for, and that's sort of, in my view, that's how MFSA has come at this inclusion issue, is not necessarily about changing the social principles, but coming at it from this other way, which is actually a really interesting one, because I think that's making the U.S. a central conference is actually the more fair way to do things.
Well, yeah,
because
absolutely.
What that says is we understand that there are differing cultural contexts in the church. The church does not take place in a vacuum divorced from its own context. And what I see happening is, as the church outside of the United States grows and people have different cultural understandings, which is fine, if they have control over how we do church in the United States, is reverse colonialism.
Well, and I think what also is here is it's a more just way to look at it, right? Why should the U.S. have a different designation than the African churches? They're the only place that it's growing, and we're not really sending, as bad as this is for my career, we're not really sending missionaries at this point. We are supporting church growth from local leaders, and they're as fully a part of this denomination as anybody else. And so to give everyone the same designation makes a lot more sense, and to give us all some freedom to be able to contextualize our ministry. because there is no ministry that isn't contextual. And so not being able to work properly within your own context, both for them and for us, is detrimental to all of us.
I also think that this has a Wesleyan precedent, too. I think that the idea that context matters in how you do church, that's John Wesley. I mean, here he is, ordaining bishops
specifically for the U.S.
Specifically for the U.S. based on some really interesting reading of the biblical text, and sends Coke and Asbury over. And I think that that's a really powerful thing that we have, is that the entire Methodist movement, as it grew and was shaped by its context, things changed within it. And I think that that's a really powerful precedent that we have, that I'm not sure I hear that argument brought up very much in these discussions. But Wesley understood that this was never, ever outside of its context.
So, speaking of things that are pretty nerdy and don't change much, the Judicial Council of the United Methodist Church, which is essentially our version of the Supreme Court, has been meeting in Baltimore in kind of its regularly scheduled meetings to make decisions about cases that have been referred to them. And the way this works is it's really complicated, but anytime a bishop makes kind of a unilateral... Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out on our live stream, there was an advertisement for Liberty University, and I think it's hilarious.
That is kind of hilarious.
Please continue.
We don't actually get to... until we start paying a lot more money, we don't get to control that. So if you want no more ads for Liberty University...
Give us money, thanks.
Pay me. Anyways, so the way this works is anytime a bishop has to make basically a unilateral decision through an official paperwork chain, the Judicial Council has to review it. And so periodically, the Judicial Council has to meet to review all of these decisions that get made. And so they did very recently. And so the results from that have been very, very recently published. And there are 4 cases that we're going to talk about. And like I said, this is difficult not to make this totally detail-oriented, but I'm going to try to make this work. There are 2 cases that look like progress in terms of LGBTQ inclusion, and then there are 2 cases that look like not progress in terms of LGBTQ inclusion. I'll start with the bad news first. There was a case out of Texas where a candidate for ministry was rejected, had her candidacy nullified because she admitted to being a practicing lesbian, living with her partner. But the case itself wasn't actually about her candidacy. It was about how the paperwork was done. And so how the decision was made. There was a vote to reinstate her. That vote did not go through. The bishop messed up on how the bishop talked about that. It got referred to the Judicial Council. The Judicial Council sent it back to the bishop. Nothing really changed, but nothing was really going to change in that case. That case wasn't really about her candidacy. It was about how turning her down and then trying to reinstate her was handled. She's not going to get reinstated. Fundamentally, the vote failed. The other thing that looks like bad news is there's a very clever amendment proposed by a layperson in the Western jurisdiction. It's the jurisdiction that includes kind of like the Southwest and California and Northwest of the United States. And so that's a very liberal area even in terms of United Methodist polity. And a layperson proposed that if a bishop does ordain a practicing homosexual, that and they are convicted in a church court for doing that, that their punishment will only be a 24-hour suspension, and then they can go back to doing their bishoply duties. Basically, okay, fine, you ordained it; it's technically against the rules. We're going to give you a slap on the wrist, and we all move on. The Judicial Council says no, you can't do that. The way the United Methodist politics work, the way it's written, all of the punishment options have to be available because punishments are always decided in the moment. And so you can't set like a mandatory, maximum sentence or whatever. You can't do that. And so that's not really a strike against inclusion. They're not making that decision based on anything to do with inclusion. It's to do with how these trials are supposed to be structured. Okay. On to the good news. The good news is good news with the caveat that it's not really that big of a step forward. Really, all the good news is, hey, you can make official statements that say that you don't like things the way they are. And that's really what these things boil down to. In the Western jurisdiction and CalPAC, California Pacific Annual Conference, they made a statement to ignore or that they urge the bishops, clergy, and lay people to act as if the statement in the social principles saying that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teachings, act as if that does not exist. The Judicial Council said, yes, you can say that. The social principles are non-binding for the most part. That is not mandatory language, and so you can say that people shouldn't follow this. This does not change the standards for marriage or ordination. Just the statement of the social principles. So basically it's like, hey, you can say that this isn't good and you don't like it in terms of the social principles. There's a similar thing out of New York, where the New York Annual Conference approved a kind of history of those who have stood in favor of inclusion as part of the official proceedings of their annual conference. And the Judicial Council said, yeah, you can do that. You're just stating facts, and you can do that, and you can say that things should change. Advocating for church law to change is within what you're allowed to do. So that's the basic rundown, and that took 2 hours of prep. But that's the basic rundown of these 4 cases. So do we feel like, with what you've just heard, do you feel like we took a step forward, or are we really just where we started?
I think something that this brought to light for me was the difference between the social principles and the doctrinal statements, and how the social principles are non-binding. So
for the most part, there's a judicial record of some of them being viewed as mandatory, but they ruled that this particular one did not have mandatory language.
Sorry. And thank you for that clarification. And so that these are things you can disagree with. I think what's a little discouraging is how set in stone the language about homosexuality is elsewhere in the discipline. And I don't think that I've really acknowledged that. I've thought about it as, what the social principles say, but there's language other places that say you can, as a clergy person, you can be defrocked for performing a homosexual union.
Which is what they want to bring Bishop Talbert up
right.
on.
You can, in the candidacy section, it talks about if you are a self-avowed practicing homosexual, you tell your bishop. There's something like an interesting.
What does self-avowed practicing homosexual mean?
Do you want me to
which is part of the problem?
Do you want me to define? Do you want the official church definition of that? Because you know what it is. Okay, so self-avowed. That's pretty clear. You say that you're a homosexual. The practicing is the thing where they had to get really detailed in what being a practicing homosexual means. What being a practicing homosexual means is you have genital contact with a member of the same sex.
And is that in the discipline, or is that in the...
No, that practicing is not defined in the discipline. That came out in one of the clergy trials. That was referred, and that's the standard that has been created. That if you have genital contact with your partner, then that's because you can be a self-avowed homosexual, because what's banned in the Bible is, in this view, is homosexual sex, specifically, right? Nothing else is, no type of relationship is talked about, just sexual relationships. And so, as long as you're upholding the standard of celibacy, it doesn't matter. But the minute you break their standard of celibacy, which they define as having genital contact with a member of the same sex, then you are a practicing homosexual. Doesn't mean you're not all that good at it and you're getting better, although it may also mean that. It's difficult sometimes.
I just wasn't aware that we had a definition. But so, and this might be getting way off topic.
Go ahead.
But so that definition, does that mean, is that a binding definition?
Defined by define your terms.
It's not in the discipline,
but it's in the judicial record. Okay. So these decisions that are made by the Judicial Council are binding.
Okay.
They are an interpretation of the discipline.
It's like Talmud.
I see. Okay.
It's exactly,
it's oral Torah.
Or to put that into
Sorry.
things that someone else will understand. It's basically exactly like the Supreme Court, right? When the Supreme Court makes a decision, that becomes an official interpretation of the Constitution.
Yeah, and that was my question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it is a binding thing. And so you have this standard. And so what happened to the woman in West Texas is she confessed to being a self-avowed practicing homosexual, and her candidacy was revoked. And so it happens. This is not a theoretical thing. And in the New York statement, one of the things they brought up is the people who have been defrocked and been denied because of performing same-sex marriages or being, an LGBTQ person themselves. So we're in a weird place. The Judicial Council, to me, looks like they want to skirt around saying anything directly about this. All of their rulings are on this part of the discipline, but we're not. And so often it would say, "Yeah, my 2012's up in Tunnel
Okay,
Hill."
I'm gonna borrow. I'm just curious about something. Go on.
A lot of the
fact checking ruins podcast,
Yeah.
but
Well, I'll keep talking and you fact check.
I'm not your facts, my facts.
Whoa, lost my train of thought. Oh, so
Sorry.
the Judicial Council seems to not really want to say anything about it. In the language of the decisions, like, look, we're not saying anything about homosexuality. We're just ruling on all of these technicalities. And, like, they make that really clear, that it's like, we're not speaking to the principles behind these things. And there was a dissent opinion in the CalPAC thing, where, good news, by the way, has some folks in the Judicial Council now. We messed up. And so, there's the dissent opinion basically saying that you shouldn't be able to say these things. But the Judicial Council, we were looking for a signal of how tightly are they going to hold to this stuff. And it basically sounds like they're not touching the doctrinal stuff. You can speak out against it as long as you are not advocating people to break the discipline. And the reason CalPAC's getting away with it is they specifically cite the social principles and not everywhere else in the discipline that it talks about the lack of inclusion. So does that, I mean, we're left in a very strange place.
I just wanted to point out, I saw this article a couple weeks ago. It was put out by the RNS, the Religion News Service.
I don't know that.
It was syndicated on Huffington Post. But it's basically, and this was before the Judicial Council met, or as they were meeting, and it pointed out there's six. There's six.
Take an average.
There were six cases throughout the connection being looked at in relation to LGBT issues, as far as, and they range from people being gay to clergy being gay to clergy performing gay weddings.
Right.
And so publicly we have seven issues and 7 things in the process at various points.
Yeah, and then that number's, if good news gets their way, that number will fixing to be 8.
Yeah.
7 or 8, because Bishop Talbert's probably going to get put up on charges. Now we'll see where that goes, but if it does get put up on charges, I don't see how he's gonna dodge that one. Because it's pretty clear that's what happened. It's just whether or not this goes to trial at all.
Yeah.
And yeah. So Kathleen, did you manage to fact check your thing?
I am correcting one of my earlier statements. The language about self-avowed practicing homosexuals does not fall under doctrinal standards. It falls under the section of the discipline about ministry of the ordained.
Yes.
But still, that's a different, that feels...
I mean, those are binding. As
right,
opposed
that's
to social
more,
principles.
exactly.
Those are binding.
And what does it mean? And I was just thinking, I wonder if there was ever a point where there was restrictive language like that about female ordination. Was it ever in disciplines directly like
Lord,
that?
I've looked at this case in my life. I think so.
Okay.
I don't think it was saying not women. I think it said in the language of only men.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But there was language that had to be changed. There were female licensed local pastors. There were female, they got called supply pastors in those days. But there were female supply pastors, and that was one of the arguments that got made on the floor by the laity. It's like, hey, look, we thought that having a female pastor might be strange, but then we had her, and she was great, and she was the supply pastor. I would just assume they were from the South. Well, the other accent I have on tap is my British one, and I'm sure it wasn't that. So that's just the one I got right now.
They're not necessarily fans of lady pastors. Well,
they do all right. There's the Vicar of Dibley. It's a lovely show.
There's always John French.
But yeah, I believe there was. That may be something I fact check after the show.
Death of podcast.
After the show, and we'll bring up next week to make sure that I'm speaking. I'm the policy geek, and I need to make sure I know that.
I don't want to go off on crazy bunny trail on this, but I think it's an interesting parallel. As a woman who is called to ministry, there's stuff in the Bible about women not being pastors. So it's just something to think about in all of these discussions that I'm not sure. Am I going way off in left field?
No, I don't think you are at all.
There's precedent for this in the Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. There is precedent for changing this kind of language. This is not totally out of left field. And I think some of the arguments that have been used, the biblical ones, are not. They're different texts, but it's the same kind of argument. It's the Bible says argument. And I think in a denomination that is relatively, at least in my experience, has been pretty affirming of ordaining women, at least officially, I think that that's a conversation worth having. And that's one I would actually really like to have with someone who is confessing movement. Is what do you do with that? Mm-hmm.
I think I can imagine their argument, right?
Okay, let's do it.
So let's do this because, okay, yes.
As he holds Butch the non-gender conforming unicorn.
You can't hold Butch the non-gender conforming unicorn if you're going to be confessing movement.
I can play the role, right?
Let's do it.
Hold on, pause. Now we have an advertisement to watch the Billy Graham something association.
They figured out we're a religious show. Great. Wonderful.
Continue.
The argument that if I was them, this is what I would say. That
can you do it in a British accent?
Well, I can. I can do anything in a British accent. But the argument that could be made is that while it does say that women shouldn't speak in church, the condition of being a woman is not inherently sinful. Mm. Whereas, some have argued it is, but in reality, I don't think you're going to find them making the argument that being a woman is not inherently sinful. But homosexuality is in fact a sin. So it's a difference between changing how we look at Scripture in terms of the equality of all people versus people who are actively and willfully participating in a sinful lifestyle. Now, keep in mind, I don't actually believe that, but that would be their argument. That would be their argument, and that's not. And while I disagree, that's not necessarily a crazy argument, right? If you believe homosexuality is a sin, then okay, fine. But I mean, this is why it can't be decided by a democratic process because it comes down to a theological position.
But it also comes down to the idea that it's a choice, too. I think it has to. I mean,
sure.
Maybe I'm wrong.
No. I think you're pointing out something very important.
I mean, most people don't just decide to be women. I mean, it's possible, but you don't like.
It's much rarer and much more difficult.
Yeah, and it's a much different argument at that point. But it's a much more difficult and a much more hard-lined argument to say I was biologically born a woman because you can look at that and prove that's the case. Whereas our conversations around sexuality, which we don't have conversations around sex or sexuality in the church, period, for the most part. And so once we stop having those conversations, then this conversations around sexuality. Once we stop having conversations around sex, then our conversation around sexuality is gone too, and then it becomes impossible to look at it as something that's inherent, and it becomes necessary to look at, or becomes easier to look at as a choice.
So I think that is the issue, right? And I heard this, in my small country church. I stayed way out of this discussion because I wanted to see how it would play out. But they were talking about, homosexuals. And one of them, I think I've brought this up on the show before, but one of my congregants was like, well, I think it's genetic. I don't think it's a choice, and God doesn't make mistakes. My cousin is gay, and they used to call him Sissy Boy. He knew we knew he was different when he was 3, long before he knew what a gay person was. Mm-hmm. He knew that we all knew he was different, and that that God doesn't make mistakes. And what do we do with that? And she couldn't resolve it. But that's a good that's at least a good tension to be in. Mm-hmm. But this argument over sin or not sin, I guess, does come down to, is it a choice or not? Coming out of the closet is a choice. Yes, absolutely. Coming out of the closet is a choice. But I think we often conflate what it is to come out of the closet and what it is to be gay. And I have thought this through in my own life. Am I gay or am I not? And what I came to is, nope, it's not how I'm programmed. But that came from a process of self-reflection. It wasn't inherent. That it wasn't, I didn't necessarily know. It is a part of me that I am a straight person. But that's how I'm wired. I'm not wired to be gay. And I think you have to go down that path of understanding it as a wiring, as something that's inherent to your being. Your sexuality and your sexual preference is programmed into you. And who's doing that programming? Well, that programming's God. And so, did God just set these folks up to fail? Nope. That's not how that works. So, that's how you get there. But that's a really difficult argument to make on the floor of General Conference.
Mm-hmm. And I think, because Trey, you and I went to the Art Reconciling Ministries training.
We did, yeah. And Stephen did as well.
Hey,
Stephen.
buddies. We heart RMN.
And this was this is the conversation I think that they're trying to have in the local churches as a part of their process for church, as a part of people coaching churches to become a reconciling congregations. This is kind of the conversation that they were trying to facilitate them having it's not necessarily trying to, although this was the end goal, not necessarily trying to get people to change their opinions on homosexuality, but to look at it and to have a conversation with it.
I really like what Reconciling Ministries Network does. I like their model. It makes a lot of sense. It's very participatory. It's very grassroots. It's very much about facilitated dialogue and people growing together in Christ. And it is a really cool idea. And I wish more churches could participate in it. But there's still that fundamental issue of, what do you do with the churches that just stand radically against? Mm-hmm. What do you do when you go to Rob Renfro's church at the Woodlands United Methodist in Houston, Texas? Well, in the Woodlands, Texas, very near Houston, where I went to high school, by the way. What do you do with that? And that's something that's very different. But it is time for us to move on in our discussion to something very much related, but slightly separate in this week's discussion. So, we've been talking about, basically that we disagree, and many people disagree, with the United Methodist Church's stance on LGBTQ inclusion. And it is a constant source of frustration for us to be in a system that does not reflect our own beliefs. And I think for each of us at this point in our lives, we've made a commitment to change. And the best way to change it is still to be a part of the system and advocate for change from within, at least in our view. But we have been hearing of a number of people, both that we know personally and that, we know of, that are leaving the United Methodist Church because of this inclusion stance. And it's turning into kind of a brain drain of young clergy, in particular. That we're losing a lot of young clergy who may themselves be avowed and practicing homosexuals, or who may just feel like that the beliefs of the United Methodist Church are so incompatible with their own beliefs on this issue that they leave. And then what are we left with? We're losing. We talk about young clergy. We need young clergy for young congregations. even if they don't all want to use technology. We're going to talk about that later.
Distracting.
We're going to talk about that later. But that we're losing good young clergy and good young people, right? Mm-hmm. In the Gen X and the millennials and whatever is going to come after them. The issue of homosexual marriage and homosexual ordination, all of that, is much more settled than it is in the United Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. And they look at this place and go, huh? Y'all are still here? We're not coming. And, and we have to constantly have this conversation of, but we're not like that. And at some point, that just gets exhausting. So what are y'all's thoughts on this kind of, this brain drain, both of young clergy and of, generally, young congregants?
I do think it is a lot of young people. I don't think it's only young people. I mean, the Methodist Church has lost, that I know of, some really, really outstanding people because of this, of all ages. And so that was something I wanted to just throw in there. This is hard. We're in a hard spot in the church. This is difficult. Quite frankly, this breaks my heart. And we've talked about this. You and I have talked about this for quite a few years. Actually, all of us have. It is so hard to be part of a church that has my heart. And my brain, too. I have yet to find any theology that feels quite as much like home as Wesleyan theology does. This is the church that grabbed me. This is the church that was a place of great healing for me. Like, this is home. And it is heartbreaking that all of this is going on in the place that I love so much. And also feeling like, where would I go? There's not any other church that I can think of. And, like, I've made the rounds that feels quite like this. And so I just feel like I'm in a really hard place. And it's so hard for me to see colleagues and people who I was really excited to work with in ministry leave. It hurts a lot. And also thinking about, what if in 15 years nothing has changed? How much can I take? I'm making a commitment to this church, and I believe in this church, and I believe in what this church can do and is. But can I live like this forever?
I mean, jumping back to Trey earlier, Trey, you were talking earlier. You mentioned that it might take 2, 3, 4 quadrennia to change.
Sure.
That's a long time, especially when the country is so far ahead of us at this point. And I think I'm convinced personally that is the breaking point for us, is that when the United States as a country, even if it's not all the states, but the vast majority of states have legalized same-sex marriage, have recognized it, that the church finds itself in a very difficult position at that point, because what do we do when we say this? It's no longer being countercultural, it's standing in the face against culture.
And I also think, I think we talk about this, and when you were talking before, I thought about this, that we talk a lot about our own beliefs, but I think what may need to be said is that I didn't, and we didn't, I'm saying we, sorry, that we didn't come to this understanding of inclusion and what we feel the church can be just because we felt it. This is derived from lots of theological reflection and engagement with Scripture. This isn't just what we feel because we think it's a good idea because we've been swayed by popular culture. This is coming from a place of deep faith. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another piece of it too.
And that's kind of in response to something we get accused of a lot. We get accused of giving into culture. Mm-hmm. That, what gets thrown in our face a lot is that line of we're supposed to be, in the world but not of the world.
Right.
And to me, it's, that is true. But that gets used to justify some really terrible things, like apartheid.
Yeah.
And that is so easy to use that line to justify not including people. That you want to play the in and out game. And again, I bring this quote up a lot, and I don't know if I brought it up here, but the United Methodist Bishop of South Africa during the fall of apartheid, Peter Story, stood with Bishop Tutu. He was a white guy, but he was on the right side of this issue. Came and spoke at my college when I was an undergrad, and he basically said that the apartheid issue of our generation is LGBTQ inclusion. Then when you get to the pearly gates, you will not be asked how big your church is, or how big the steeple was that sat on top of it. You will be asked where you stood with if you stood with the homosexuals or not. That we must stop playing the game of who's in and who's out, and get on to the work of building God's kingdom. It's a paraphrase. I wish I had written the exact quote down. But this is not giving in to culture. In many ways, if you live in the southern United States, it is standing firmly in opposition to culture. Mm-hmm. And it bothers me sometimes when there are churches and there are places in secular culture that are able to speak more what I think Christ would speak than we are able to. We try not to on this show to pull our punches, but you'll notice occasionally we do. For instance, Kathleen and I don't sign our jobs, we just sign our names. That then there are some stances that we probably believe that we don't fully explicate. Because, although we are trying to fly in face of fear, there is still fear. And fear is detrimental to the human spirit, and fear is not of Christ. And if we're living in a culture of fear, when I know gay clergy who are dear friends of mine, who have to hide a fundamental aspect of their identity for fear of losing their jobs and their calling which Christ has put on their lives, that is not of God, and that is breaking the fundamental Methodist principle of do no harm. We are doing deep harm. And it is disgusting. And currently I fight from within, but I don't even know how long I can fight from within if we don't see progress. And I'm just being honest. I may be part of that brain drain 10 years down the road if this is what keeps going.
And that it's not, the thing about this kind of harm is it's not just harming the people who are, quote, against the language and the discipline. This is hurting all of us, and this is hurting the church, and this is hurting what we are called to do, and what does it mean to be part of the kingdom of God. This is getting in the way of what God is up to in the world. And that is heartbreaking. We are doing actual harm to LGBTQ people with this stance. We're also hurting everyone else too, because if we are creating a church that does not look like the fullness of the kingdom of God, we are missing the point.
But also, here I am fact-checking. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center has synthesized studies on LGBTQ suicide. Between 30 and 40% of LGBT youth, depending on age and sex group, have attempted suicide. Now, I did a study, I wrote a paper last year that analyzed these statistics in light of this idea of minority stress. That being a person on the margins is psychologically detrimental. And those infrastructures and institutions that play into creating this minority stress are implicit in, or are complicit in LGBTQ suicide. We are doing very real harm, not just to the brain drain of our denomination, but to the people that we claim to be shepherds of.
And I think one of the more disturbing arguments I've heard is that excluding LGBTQ people from participation in church leadership, as far as clergy goes and all that kind of stuff, is that, we're doing it out of love. That we are we are just loving people, and part of loving people is disciplining them. And that's one of the more disturbing arguments that I've heard, and I think that the alarmingly high suicide rates among LGBTQ youth really pushes back against that.
Well, I think that's interesting, right? But it always just comes down to, is it a sin or not? Now, obviously, we've made a clear stance on that. But if you think it's a sin, then yes, part of good shepherding or good parenting is discipline and is holding people accountable. I get that. But homosexuality is not something you don't choose to be a homosexual. Nope. And since you're not choosing to do it, you're either inherently screwed or it's not a sin. Yeah. And we will not resolve this question tonight, or maybe in 20 years of ministry. But
I don't understand why not.
Yeah, I know. But we have some listener feedback that we'd like to play.
I'm gonna hold on to Butch.
So, Sydney, if you can play our voicemail from Jimmy from Houston, Texas.
Hey, SYN Boldly crew, this is Jimmy in Houston, and I'm calling about the Twitter coverage on last week's episode. And I'd say that I disagree with Kathleen and Stephen, and I would agree with Trey. Although Twitter can be used in a negative way and such that it disrupts the service, I think that doesn't mean that it should be completely thrown out as a medium. Twitter, because of its public nature, I think that it could really enrich the worship of the church. And this is what I mean by that. The guy that sits next to me at church, because we're all Methodists and we all sit in the same place every single week,
yeah.
He always takes notes of what is being said during the sermon and what he thinks of it. And so what if he were to share that on Twitter, and then I was to see it and I respond, and then at the end of the service there is a great variety of stories and opinions from the actual congregation instead of just from the pastor, and it might be something that people can connect with a little bit better and share in their church rather than just sitting there and passively listening. It gives them the opportunity to actively participate and in some ways maybe even focus better during the sermon than if they were just sitting there passively.
So I find Jimmy's comment, if you don't know, Jimmy and I do a tech news podcast called Tech's Last Call every Thursday night. And so he also listens to this show, and so he felt moved to speak. And I think it's interesting, and a lot of it, I think, what I've been thinking about over the past week is this idea of learning styles. Mm-hmm. For some folks, they're note takers. And this is a way that if you have a note and you want to share it, you can share it in a more public forum. Now, how that gets integrated into worship can happen in any number of ways. The idea that I came up with is having the position of a community manager. So rather than the pastor sorting through the comments live, which is crazy, you're absolutely right about that, you have someone whose job during the worship service, just like you'd have someone running the soundboard and someone running the lights and someone, doing all the other logistical matters. You have someone managing the comments. And then the top few comments get sent to the pastor's iPad, which they have up at the front of church, and they read in 3 minutes at the end of the sermon, they read the top 3 comments that the community manager has pulled. And that way people have a different way of actively engaging. For some folks, they want to sit and they want to listen, and that's what they want to do. But some people, they want to be in conversation with the ideas that are happening. It's kind of like group discussion versus lecture. And this is allowing some sort of melding of the two. There are hundreds and thousands of ways to do this terribly. But that doesn't inherently mean that it has to be terrible and cannot be used.
I still maintain, because I'm a stubborn ex-German Lutheran, that I don't disagree with you. I think that people do have different learning styles, and I think that note-taking and people who do that and process things like that and want to have those conversations should absolutely have those conversations. I don't think that via Twitter during the worship service is the time. I think those conversations should absolutely happen. I just don't think having them happen live while preaching is happening is the best way.
But then what do you say to the little old lady that's note-taking?
I'm all about that. What's
the difference?
Because note-taking is you so you're doing one thing, right? Like you're taking a note, you're processing things, you're taking a note, and you're listening to the sermon. Fine. If you add Twitter into that, you are processing, typing it into Twitter, seeing what's going on, what other people are saying. There's a lot more moving.
But not necessarily. I
pieces.
mean, to me, the difference could just be you're taking a note, writing it down, or you're taking a note and hitting send.
Can I stand in the middle of you guys on this one? And,
Sure.
And
Such a good Methodist, Harrison.
I know.
Such a good Methodist.
I try. And say, like, I think it really depends on the other uses of technology in the service. And I think of my context where there is no, I mean, other than like microphones and things like that, there is no other use of technology in the service. We don't have the screens with the words on them.
Sure.
We don't have anything else.
And
so I think opening the door of like having a sermon series or having with a hashtag for the series or having just a hashtag for Twitter in general to allow an outlet for people who do want to tweet can be valuable, but not requiring it during the service.
Yeah.
And not necessarily making it a part of the service. But then I'm also thinking, like, on the back end as a pastor, how valuable that could be to follow up with someone after that. But, of course, I'm also behind the 8 ball because I didn't listen to last week's podcast.
It's okay. It's available on demand, as are all past episodes, and as will this one be very shortly. On that note, it is time to end. Thank you very much for joining us on this week's SYN Boldly. Thank you to Harrison for coming out on a school night. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Butch, the non-gender conforming unicorn. We deeply appreciate your support, and we appreciate all of you who are listening. If you have any feedback or would like to contribute to the show, as Jimmy did, or as Harrison has, email us, synboldly@nfear.org, at SYN Boldly on Twitter, or facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night.